Good evening, everybody. This is really fun for me, these webinars, because they kind of pick a topic that I like to hear about and get feedback on, and so it's always useful for me to do this as well. What has been occurring to me lately, and it's I think a function of the rolling over of a new year, a calendar year, 2019. I don't necessarily think New Year's resolutions work very well, but I do like to kind of remind myself this time of year of a concept that's been really useful for me in recovery called beginner's mind. And of course, we hear a lot about beginners in the Fawcett program and other recovery groups, but I think it certainly incorporates a lot of what we think about as traditional beginners, but it has some unique aspects that I think are useful for recovery kinds of activities. So what is this beginner's mind I'm talking about? I think it comes out of Buddhist tradition. A lot of meditators use it, and basically what it is just this idea of beginning a task or beginning a process with actually no expectation and literally knowing nothing about it. And so it's that if you can think of a situation in your life where you kind of walked into something and really didn't have an expectation, you didn't know what to expect or how it might go, and the kind of anxiety that it causes, but also the refreshing and kind of exhilarating ability to connect with things when we don't have expectations that, at least in my case, cause us to miss things. So it's this idea of beginning new tasks without understanding anything about it. And it's this idea of being free of biases and opinions so that we can, we don't have any preconceived notions about it. This, of course, is easier said than done, right? Because we all have these notions, we all have expectations, and with something like recovery or recovery groups, it can be quite terrifying to, for me at least, the construct of my addiction and how I managed it was kind of what kept me going. It was kind of the glue that held this disintegrating me together, and I think I was really clinging to that because it's all I had in recovery, and a lot of that, of course, had to change. But where this is important, I think, for recovery is that it's really critical for acceptance, which is really, I guess, the key kind of foundational concept of recovery is this idea that we need to accept who we are, that we have a problem, and that we need to do something about it, and it's our responsibility. And I think that ability to have a beginner's mind in this, when we're doing a really kind of shifting world vision of really, it's like an earthquake, right? It shakes everything up and causes a lot of upset and is quite terrifying. But it also is, I think, what needs to be done to kind of reconstruct. This just came to me. I don't want to get off too in the weeds, but there's a Hindu god called Shiva, who is the god of destruction and creation, right? And people kind of wonder, how can that be? But basically, he's the one that kind of tears down the old, but also recreates the new. And for me, that's a perfect idea of the process of recovery. So what happens to beginner's mind? How do we lose it before we get it back? One, I think, reason for that is a lot of shame and stigma about addiction. We kind of go underground, we judge ourselves, we don't share really what's going on with other people. We oftentimes don't really share what's going on with ourselves. And so I think there's a lot of secrecy and shame and stigma where we can't see our own patterns objectively. And we kind of definitely lose that beginner's mind. A lot of that has to do with, I think, self-talk, that the critical voice in our head that is this constant chatter of kind of negativity sometimes. And so I think we start to lose that ability to really see with our eyes wide open because of stigma and shame. The other thing I've seen over the years is that drives people away from this beginner's mind concept is that addicts become experts at addiction. And I think we start to know all about it. We know quantities, we know our reactions, we know how to pace, at least we think we do. We know how to control, we think we do. So I think there's a lot of this ability to kind of shoot ourselves in the foot by becoming such experts at our behaviors or our addictions and our recovery from those weekend outing or a month-long outing of drugs or acting out. We've kind of learned how to manage that. We lose the idea that there could be a different way of doing it. And that expert thing is just I've seen it over and over again. My first counseling job was treating eating disorders, and the people were just such experts at nutrition and calories and knowing how many hours of cycling would be required for this brownie, and just they knew much more about it than I did. And when I deal with stimulant abusers, they know much more about the drug use than I did. I was an alcoholic. And so I think that ability to kind of step away from our expertise in the addiction really helps promote recovery. So all that leads to this kind of hardened belief system of what it's going to be like. And there's something in psychology called confirmation bias, where if we start to see things to be in a certain way, we're going to find evidence for that. We're going to see evidence for it. And it's a problem in research studies where if they're not careful, they can sort of look and not consciously, but pick out the results they're looking for. And I think we can do the same thing with our addiction if we're not careful, including 12-step recovery or other kinds of meeting programs where we may walk in and expect to see something, a ranting person talking about God in a way that we don't resonate with or something. That might be something that's maybe the only thing we see at that meeting, and we miss all the other good stuff. So I think it's important to really get that beginner's mind piece. So how do we do that? I think, first of all, we need to be open to possibilities. And that, for many of us that had kind of a history of relapse and recovery, we start to expect that recovery. There's a hopelessness that sets in, I think, with certain behaviors, with all addiction, but I think especially with stimulants, with sex addiction, there's this repetitive nature that seems to be so out of control. So being open to possibilities, using that beginner's mind and program to never be an expert, right? I think, and that's where, to keep it green, to keep it fresh, whatever the expression may be in your part of the country, where we have to remember what it was like and not get too far away from why we need to be in this recovery space. So learning as we go, never becoming an expert, taking what works and leave the rest. And that may sound familiar, right? I think that's a slogan in certain 12-step programs, but really just taking what is there. And if something doesn't resonate, something doesn't seem to work for us, to just let it go and try something else. And finally, that for me, this was a hard one, to recognize that what is working today in my recovery may need to have an adjustment tomorrow. So again, constantly kind of being open, having that beginner's mind. For me, at the end of my drinking career, I drank at home. I was not a bar drinker. So home for me was a really dangerous place to go. So I would go to work all day, go to an early evening meeting, go to a late evening meeting, go out to coffee, and just sort of roll home in time to drop into bed and get up and go to work because I was afraid to be at home alone. And that worked. That kept me sober and going to several meetings a day for more than a year. But then I realized after a point, that behavior was kind of hiding from things that I needed to deal with and address. And I was just kind of running and hiding out in a way that wasn't facing the next things I needed to do. Another example from my own life years ago, I was drinking a lot of, I think a great deal in those times because I was gay and trying to come out. I was very closeted. And so I went to AA meetings for about, those meetings I talked about for over a year, avoiding a gay meeting. And finally realized if I'm going to deal with this issue, I need to be around other gay men. And started got sober in New York, so I was in the Village. And so that was a shift, a major shift. And I kind of recreate my group, but it was something I needed to do at that point in my recovery. So I think each of us have examples that are different, but I think that concept of the beginner's mind is really useful at any point. And so I'll stop there. We can talk about that. I'm happy to talk about that, or really anything that is on people's minds. So I'm curious what people have to say.
So if you want to ask questions or make comments, the easiest way to do that is the Q&A feature down at the bottom of your screen. You can also use the chat feature, but everybody will see your name with the chat feature. David, you reminded me about when I was new to recovery and some of the things I heard repeatedly directed at me were, the more you think you know, the harder it is to recover. And I also heard the phrase contempt prior to investigation a lot because I knew it all. And it did not serve me well. I was in and out for a couple years before I really got any kind of sobriety, and I had to get beaten way down before I was able to, accept information and advice from other people.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty common experience too. And speaking for me, at least, kind of all I had was kind of what I thought I knew, and trying to keep holding it together as things were crumbling around me, and so that was a defense. And I really had to allow myself to be vulnerable and to admit I didn't know, and I didn't know about the program. I didn't know what to expect about it, but I also didn't know a lot about me. I didn't know what I was feeling. I didn't know I didn't know what I wanted. I didn't know anything, and that's a hard one to admit. And I also was pretty sure that any kind of 12-step program wasn't right for me, that I didn't really belong there. And so I was going in with that idea of the contempt before I even had a chance to give it a shot. And unfortunately, I wasted a lot of time with that. I think before I surrendered, and that's another word we hear, but I think this idea of beginner's mind is really essential for both the concept of acceptance and surrender, for sure.
One other thing that I add while we wait for the questions to ramp up here is the beginner's mind is something that I kind of cherish in myself now. The phrase that I use is I see the world with new eyes, or the eyes I had when I was a child. Things are more interesting, things are new and exciting, and even when they're not new and exciting, I'm just not as jaded anymore. And I think that's a function of doing the work of recovery over a number of years. But it wasn't something I could do when I walked in the door. I was incredibly jaded and, justifying. I was very busy justifying my own behavior and my own thinking, and not really open to anything outside of myself that might make my life better.
Right. And I think that is such a common experience for people new in recovery, at least. We kind of have to be gentle with ourselves and with them, because it really, for me, it was a long unwinding of some of that belief system and the willingness to kind of say, okay, I don't know, maybe these people know more than I do, and that's where I think listening was useful for me, to kind of just sit there and not have to express how much I knew and reveal how much I really didn't know at all. So I think, and I love the idea too of through the eyes of a child, because I think as we grow quickly, we kind of lose that magic that kids have that are just so open to things. And I think we can all learn a lot from that ability to notice and take joy in little things even. That became a big part of the pleasure of recovery for me, was taking pleasure in that. Beautiful day, a funny expression on my dog's face, or whatever. A great omelet, whatever it was.
I love the word magic that you used. Life becomes kind of magical sometimes, not all the time, but with recovery. We have a question here. It says, I'm a sex addict and just had my second relapse after being sober and recovered for 3 years. I'm sorry to hear that. It's not entirely unusual. It seems like each time I relapse, I learn a new thing about me and my addictions, my triggers, and potential causes. Is this typical? And is there a time when you finally figure out your addiction triggers and get it and no longer relapse? Very good question.
Wow. Great question. And congratulations for sticking in there and for the time you put together. It's significant. It really is. And I would say relapse is probably pretty typical, right? It's very typical. I think it's one of those things where it's kind of to be expected, and it's something I don't want to encourage, but I think it's also something you don't want to shame people about, because it's such a normal part of the process. So I think because it is such a normal part of the process, what happens, and it sounds like this may have happened with you, is that as people absorb information in meetings, as they get more information about themselves in recovery, they're learning. And if they do relapse, hopefully that relapse is shorter, briefer, less intense, and gets them back, and they can kind of do a post-mortem on it and see what happened. What can I learn from this? Exactly the process you're describing. And I think sometimes we can figure it out without having to do it, without having to act out. Other times we don't. It comes out of the blue. It's a trigger that we didn't expect. It's a surprise, strong feeling that catches us off guard, and we kind of revert to our old coping mechanism without really thinking, whatever the circumstances. But I think each time that happens, we can learn from that and kind of add a patch to our recovery kit, and we'll be covered from that point on. And I also think, and maybe I'm going to push the metaphor too far, but if you break a bone, when it heals, that's really that's one of the strongest points of the bone. And I think if the same thing applies when we relapse over an issue, if we can learn from it and fall out of the pattern of repeating it over and over again, but really use beginner's eyes and learn from it, that becomes something that we can be really well defended against. And actually learn, it probably says something about us, that some life lesson that we need to pay attention to. At least for me, the things that cause me grief or emotional pain are the things that became the biggest doorways to profound healing. Really, those are the gifts of recovery. But you have to notice them and deal with them. So I'd say it's very typical. The last part of your question about the timing, I think there's no magic number there that anybody can use. I think what I've seen typically that those kind of things slow down as people gain wisdom, and I think the more recovery we have under our belt, the more we can sort of deal with these oddball situations that may trigger us out of the blue, and we get to get a momentum in recovery. So I think there is a point where those fade, where where we've kind of worked through all those triggers and connections and have overwritten them with recovery actions that makes it easier to tolerate. So I can't give you a magic number, but I think it's certainly a process, and you're well on your way. It does get better. It does get better.
Yeah, there's a couple things I would add to David's response there. Number one, sex addiction is not like alcoholism or compulsive gambling, where sobriety is so easily and well defined. If you're an alcoholic, you don't drink, you're sober. Sex addicts, everybody's sobriety looks a little different. Everybody's plan for sobriety looks a little different. And it's not something where we don't never want to have sex again or be sexual again. It's more like an eating disorder, where we have to learn how to be healthy instead of eliminating something entirely from our lives. So that's point number one. And that's, I think, one of the reasons that relapse is, I don't know if it's more common among sex addicts, but I mean, I'm in both programs, and I would say it's probably more common among sex addicts. The other point I wanted to make, well, there's 3 points I wanted to make. The second point was there's a difference between a slip and a relapse. Dr. Rob defines it as: a slip is you do something that's part of your inner boundary, and then you come clean about it right away. That's a slip. A relapse is a slip that you keep secret. And it's going to keep happening until you talk about it. So I'm glad you're here, and I'm glad you're talking about it. And then the third point I wanted to make, I have a sponsee who's, he slips about every 3 to 12 months. And I've been sponsoring him for about 3 years, and this is the pattern. What I keep reminding him is he doesn't forget what he learned. He gets to learn something new, which is a point David made and you made. And his life is better today than when he started recovery. It's infinitely better today. And that's the thing that I always, because he tends to beat himself up for making a mistake. And yeah, it's not great. We don't encourage it, but learn from it, move on, and accept the fact that your life is a hell of a lot better today than when you started recovery. And I suspect that's probably the case for you, or you wouldn't come back after a relapse. Your life is better in recovery. So we have another question here that came in through the chat feature, David, and I think this is right up your alley. Why is masturbation so addictive?
That's a great question. Well, we as human beings are hardwired with some behaviors that help us survive as a species. And that goes, we get little bursts of dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter in our brain that creates a feeling of euphoria, a little bit burst of goodness. And we get those from eating good food, from belonging, from cooperating, from loving one another, from being connected, and most of all, from orgasm. And I think, so that orgasm, whether we're masturbating or having sex with another person, is this big shot of dopamine that makes us feel good in a way that's very addictive. And so on its face, it's a behavior that that'll continue to give reward, if you will, in terms of this dopamine release and feeling good. The problem with that is that if we talk about the concept of self-soothing, which is really where we are feeling nervous or anxious or depressed or bored or less than or some kind of negative feeling, sometimes we learn how to deal with those feelings in ways that aren't very productive. And something like masturbation or any other addictive behavior, by the way, is a great way to numb ourselves or dissociate from those uncomfortable feelings. And so I think oftentimes, not only is masturbation in itself, it feels good and it's potentially highly addictive, but when it's combined with an escape, when it's used as kind of a bandage to cover up feelings that are uncomfortable, to dissociate, to remove, to numb, that's when it becomes problematic. And so people start to turn, if someone gets into a compulsive masturbation, they will be masturbating even though that dopamine reward is long since diminished. They're not feeling as good about it. It doesn't do what it once did in terms of making them feel good, but it's this compulsive thing to try to continually numb or comfort themselves, soothe themselves with this behavior. And it's like all sexual acting out, like all addiction, it runs its course where it certainly starts to lose the benefit. And so I think people continue anyway and get particularly lost and hopeless and feel ashamed, and there's a lot of negative feelings that start to compound the whole process. But so yeah, I think masturbation is a beautiful thing, right? It's not, and masturbation itself is not the issue. It's when we take that beautiful thing and try to use it to soothe ourselves and feel better about an issue instead of dealing with it directly or wanting to deal with it directly.
Can you talk a little bit about when porn is coupled with masturbation, what that does to the dopamine and kind of in terms of extending that escapist high?
Right. So, yeah, when we combine certain behaviors, so some people call it stacking, where we would stack porn on top of masturbation, maybe on top of some drug use as well. It is used to kind of compound the effect, right? To increase the effect. But that has a couple other unanticipated consequences. One is that the brain is always trying to adapt to this kind of stimulation of dopamine release. So it kind of starts to reduce the dopamine for any one of these events that's released. And so that is what we call tolerance, where people need more to get the same reward. So people start to escalate in terms of their behaviors. And that can be with porn or with masturbation. You get into the realm of sexual fantasy. And what often happens, this happens by the way with stimulant users as well, methamphetamine and cocaine. People start to have to escalate the kind of porn, the kind of behaviors, escalate the risk perhaps to themselves. Maybe they're taking bigger chances. Maybe they go into the more taboo factor, rougher kinds of stuff. We get into all kinds of areas that where people are doing or having sexual fantasies about things that they never thought they would have, right? These are the brain kind of migrates down these dark paths. And I think that is a real problem for people too, because that drives them further underground. They feel a lot of shame about it. I've had clients who actually, I think, could be diagnosed with PTSD from some of the fantasies and places their brains went on these hours of compulsive masturbation and pornography. So I think that's a problem. There's a second issue, a big issue, that when someone is constantly using pornography and masturbating, there's this kind of high-speed transition from one image to the next, to the next, to the next. And the brain becomes accustomed to this constant level of high stimulation in a way that no human partner can replicate. It's a very different process. To me, a healthy and intimate sexual relationship would be longer, slower, with a person with whom I can really have an exchange of energy, of thoughts, of feelings, of emotion, kind of a going back and forth in a way that has some depth. And I think that high-speed changing of images really affects someone, so that if they're used to that level of stimulation through porn, they have a very hard time relating or having sex with a partner. They can't get aroused from a partner because it's slower. There's a lot of other issues where anyone, oftentimes, that they have feelings of affection for, also kind of move out of the realm of sexual attractions. There's separation of, if there's an emotional bond, sometimes there's no sexual attraction, and the two become kind of separated. So a lot of complications happen. So when we combine things like that, it kind of escalates the whole game, and it spins out pretty quickly, very destructively.
Yeah, is that why we're seeing so much erectile dysfunction in otherwise young, healthy guys who tend to report that they're heavy porn users?
Right. So there's this really interesting phenomena that we're still trying to kind of get our hands around here, that these young guys, particularly, that I guess you'd call them digital natives, right? They grew up with technology. They've never not known technology. And so their sex lives from the time they hit puberty have been highly involved with tech, with their iPhones, with their iPads, and porn. And so there's this tremendous exposure at a very young age to a lot of this dynamic that I'm talking about, with these high-speed images, need for more stimulation, need for excitement, need for something new, need for something more taboo, rougher, whatever. And in many cases, by the way, these people have never had sex with a person. They get so kind of caught up in the porn life. But what that does is that it ultimately leads to erectile dysfunction, because the brain, the whole idea of we could whole night sometime on how do erections happen, but basically it's a very complicated process, and it starts with the brain. And if the brain has been kind of taken off track by this habit of pornography and masturbation, it's not going to be able to send the adequate signals so someone can get physically erect. It's just not going to happen. And so we're seeing a lot of young men who physiologically have no reason why they should be experiencing erectile dysfunction, having erectile dysfunction. And it comes down to the changes in the brain and the stimulation levels needed.
And what they're finding is that Viagra and Cialis don't help, because if an erection starts in the brain, and Viagra and Cialis and those other drugs work, they're physical. They still have to have a trigger from the brain to get the erection. Right. And that's what some of these young guys are finding. The good news is when particularly the really young guys step away from porn, their brains can kind of reset and get them back to a baseline. And 3 to 6 months. Older men tends to take a little longer, but we take a little longer with those things anyway.
But you're right. Even in someone who has no addictive issues at all, the drugs like Viagra only work about 4 out of 5 times. 20% of cases they don't work at all. But they do require a strong signal of attraction and desire coming from the brain, and they work down in the genitals. That's their area. But if they don't have that signal coming, it's not going to work at all. And that's exactly what you just said, Scott. And that's exactly.
To go back to one of the points you made earlier, I kind of wanted to reiterate, addicts, especially sex addicts, it's not about feeling good. usually. It's more about feeling nothing. And that's why we'll look at porn and masturbate for 6 hours straight, or we'll get in the car and cruise for prostitutes all day without actually picking someone up. And we do it because we're high when we're doing it. It's not the orgasm that we really, really want, even though the orgasm is really pleasurable. That's not what's driving our addiction. What's driving our addiction is we don't want to feel stress, anxiety, depression, loneliness, boredom, whatever. So we do anything that will trigger our brains enough to get us out of feeling the feelings we don't want to feel. It's very escapist. An alcoholic gets so drunk he can't think about his problems. A sex addict gets so wound up in porn and masturbating, right? Edging, that kind of thing, that he forgets about his problems temporarily. So
Yeah,
I don't know if you guys want to add to that.
absolutely. Yeah. And to go back to the point that the person wrote before, where they have had a relapse or a lapse and they're back and trying to learn from those things. What we know, it just went in my head. I know that now with different kinds of scans we can do of people's brains, we can actually see what happens to people's brains when they get triggered either by a phone, by an app, by looking at porn, and we can watch what happens. And Scott's actually right that the brain starts to release that dopamine, kind of like a dog salivating, right? The brain starts to release it and we get a little bit of a high long before we ever act out, act out in terms of picking up a drug in a substance user case, or perhaps, acting out is, I'll keep it in a substance abuser's case. With methamphetamine, the guys that I work with meth, they're actually getting high when they're online looking for sex partners and thinking about the drug, or getting their paraphernalia ready, long before they've ever ingested the drug. And I think, to bring it back to that earlier question with relapse, we really have to look at the behaviors that go into creating a relapse or lapse long before we ever actually act out. So it may be thinking about that a long time. It may be sneaking onto an app to see who's around. It may be other little things. And that's where those inner boundaries are really important for people to know what is the trigger for them. But it's important to know that anytime we act out, it has a long list of precursors, right, in terms of our beliefs, probably negative emotional states, all kinds of things that go into it and ultimately lead to that behavior.
There's a long history of research, particularly with stimulant addiction, hooking the brain up to EKGs or whatever they monitor the brain with. And certain parts of the brain, like a cocaine addict's brain, will light up if you show him an image of cocaine in the same exact places as it lights up when he's actually using cocaine.
Right.
The same parts of the brain are activated. And now there's been some great research coming out of the United Kingdom from Cambridge University, a woman named Valerie Voon, and she's doing the same with like self-identified porn addicts and sex addicts. And if you show a porn addict a porn image, the same parts of his brain will light up as somebody who's high on cocaine or thinking about getting high on cocaine. It's the same pleasure centers. It's all the same reaction as any other addiction. And that's why some of the people who treat this are so insistent on calling it addiction rather than compulsive this or sexual compulsivity, which is also fine if that works for people. But please ask questions, by the way. You can use the Q&A feature or the Zoom. David and I can talk about this all day, but this is for you, not us. So ask us some questions. And David, can you talk a little bit about, while we're waiting on that, you talked about how like masturbation doesn't have the power it did, but we keep doing it because we want to escape. Can you talk a little bit about how the brain adjusts over time to, getting smacked with too much dopamine and how we, anhedonia, things like that?
Right. So the brain is really this amazing organ that is constantly trying to adjust and adapt. And so if we are overstimulating ourselves with drugs, with pornography, with other kinds of sexual acting out, with whatever kind of addictive behavior it might be, at first it's a thrill, right? And I think many addicts will talk about that first amazing experience with any drug, with heroin, with methamphetamine, with sex in a certain way. The first time they saw a certain image of porn, very specific sometimes, that it's like this amazing moment that they're constantly trying to recapture. And I think very quickly, it becomes evident that they can't ever go there again. The brain has this one incredible burst of dopamine, and then it it's kind of all downhill after that over the long haul. But what happens then is that the brain starts to shed dopamine receptors. And so it's the equivalent of if you're sitting in front of a music speaker and it's really loud, you turn down the volume. And so the brain will actually shed receptors so it doesn't have to have so much dopamine interaction as a way of regulating the amount of stimulation it's getting. The brain will adapt to this constant level of stimulation in a way that, and I talk about it sometimes, if we have reserves of dopamine in our brain, this chemical that makes us feel good, if you think of it as water in a water tank and you just open the faucets and let it run all the time, eventually there's not going to be very much pressure there and not much force. And I think that happens with the ability to have dopamine cause any reaction to help us feel good at all. This incredible loss of dopamine through addictive behaviors that results in a lot of depression, a lot of sadness, a lot of hopelessness, a term we use called anhedonia, which is literally the inability to experience pleasure. Everything is kind of dark. And so that's really a consequence of the brain just kind of being shot with the dopamine system and having nothing left. And that takes a while to recover. Kind of the bad news for stimulants, and I'm talking methamphetamine particularly, which is so destructive on this dopamine system, it takes up to 2 years for those pathways to regenerate. And I suspect it's a similar process for sex addiction, but Scott, I don't know if that's actually been researched or quantified in the way that...
Not that I'm aware of, but anecdotal evidence would suggest anywhere from a year to 2 years. Usually.
Yeah. And so it does come back, but in the meantime, people remain kind of depressed and hopeless. And another thing, if you don't have dopamine, people are very impulsive, which can lead to relapse. They're sensitive to kind of emotional outbursts. And so it's a really tough road, because sex addiction and stimulant addiction, the recovery is not easy in the beginning, or at all really, but especially in the beginning. And I think if people aren't really feeling the rewards, if they're not feeling better, it makes it even more complicated. So when the brain starts shedding dopamine receptors and you don't get the rush, but the other parts of your brain remember the rush, and they want it. If I'm a porn addict, my brain still remembers the rush I used to get from porn, so I keep looking at porn and clicking on the next image, the next image, the next image, looking for that rush. A meth addict keeps using meth. A heroin addict keeps shooting up. They're chasing, they're trying to get back to zero. They're not trying to get high anymore. They're trying to get back to zero. That's what a heroin addict will call chasing the dragon. Right.
You can't catch it. So we got a couple questions here. First one is getting some electronic monitoring software loaded on a sex addict's devices, mobile phone, PC, etc., so the spouse can monitor all the communications via text, email, websites, apps, app use, and keep the addict in recovery a good idea.
Okay, so there are now a number of different kinds of softwares that do monitor that. They monitor screen time and prohibit access to certain sites and things like that. I think those are probably most useful for the addict themselves in terms of helping avoid those triggers, those impulsive things we talked about before, and just kind of not going there. Ultimately kind of keeping them a little more honest in that sense. I found that the more steps, and not that addicts can't, right? If somebody really wants to get somewhere, they're going to get there. But I think the more steps you can introduce between that impulse and the actual acting out, the better it is, because there's fewer chances it's going to happen. I think it's important, one of the big issues for couples caught up in sex addiction is this issue of trust and regaining trust, and almost always the addict feels he's changed, believes he's changed, and wants his partner to know that too. And for the partner who's been wounded and hurt in profound ways by the behavior, that trust isn't happening so fast. And so sometimes I think it can be useful to have this transparency where people can monitor or have codes to the phone so you can check as a parent might for their adolescent kids. So yeah, I think it's as a way of kind of proving stuff over the long haul. Just me personally as a therapist, I'd kind of want to encourage less kind of monitoring behavior like that, and more trust and dialogue about what's happening, what the process is, what were the stressors, what was challenging, what worked, what does the partner need, kinds of things, I think are a better way to solve the bottom line issues. I think this technology is helpful. It's useful. I think it's a tool. I think becoming over-reliant on it as a solution, a total solution, is problematic. So I think ultimately we've got to, as partners, have to start to learn to trust each other and or not. And this kind of transparency, I think, is useful early on. As it goes on, I want to talk about how it's used. I don't know, Scott, do you have any?
Yeah, I strongly agree with David on that last little bit. By the way, I posted, there's an article on sex and relationship healing about tech that's useful to sex addicts. Ultimately, a sex addict's recovery has to be about the addict, not the partner. I can't recover for someone else. I have to recover for me. And, the day I went into a meeting, for me, is my sobriety date. I've not relapsed from that day. But I had, for a couple years, I was going to meetings to satisfy other people and to, stop my consequence. I didn't want to change my life. The day I went in because I said, I can't live this way anymore, is the day I got sober and stayed sober. So, electronic monitoring software, we call them parental control softwares because that's what they were originally designed for, is parents watching their kids, which makes some amount of sense, debatably. They work for sex addicts. You can change the settings so adults can use them and still actually go on and read the news and things like that. But they're not going to stop you from acting out, and they're not going to stop you from hiding things from your spouse. Any sex addict who's worth his salt or her salt can get around these products or go buy a phone and use it in secret, or, there's 100 ways to get around it. Trust has to be earned over time. This is a tool that can help you re-earn trust. And it's a tool, as David said, that can put a stumbling block between you and acting out. It can trip you for a few minutes, maybe so you can have a better thought. But not the be all and end all of recovery, but helpful.
Yeah, for sure.
We have another question here. This is from a partner. My husband didn't really escalate what he watched. I think we're talking about porn here, but instead just rejected me for porn. Is that normal?
Yeah, I would have to say that is normal. It's a normal process. But when people get caught up in pornography like that, for the reasons we spoke of earlier, where they start to get this great dopamine rush that at first feels good, and later is just kind of to try to get them back to normal, to stop feeling unpleasant, to put it one way, just to get back to sort of square one. They're acting out. And I think they get caught up in this, and for the reasons we talked about before, they start to disconnect from their partner. And I think some of that is shame, some of that is underlying issues that probably were there before, but I think a lot of it is this really physiological process of the brain kind of changing and requiring more stimulation in the way that porn can do for a while that a human being cannot. And so I think it's a very typical and very painful process for partners who kind of are excluded. They become a third in this relationship. So I think it's a very, very common process, and one that does, it's not a hopeless situation. People do recover from that, but it takes time and patience. And because we have to kind of retrain our brains to find pleasure at a lower level of stimulation, at a normal kind of human pace level of stimulation, in a way that people have been having sex and loving sex for hundreds and thousands of years, right? It's a slower pace, not this kind of crazy image after image after image that we see on pornography that kind of distorts and really hijacks that whole system. So the task for the addict is to really learn how to slow it down, how to rediscover sexual desire at a much lower volume. And the beauty in that, the silver lining, is that when you talk to people who've done it, that sex and intimacy is much better than they've ever had before. It's a really beautiful thing, because they're really connected in a way that they probably weren't before. They have access to their feelings, they are communicating, they have empathy, they understand. I try to, when I have clients who get pretty down about this because their relationships are just simply struggling and not going along well sexually, I often try to get them to a place where they can interact with people who have longer recovery, who they can see, get testimony basically from people about how this works. And I think it's much more effective coming from someone who's lived it and is standing there saying, they have 10 years of recovery and things are better than they ever have been with their partner. And I think people need to hear that. And my message there is that there is hope. I think a lot of times people get hopeless about this, but there is definitely hope in recovery. It's a long process, but a lot of us are in it for the long haul too. So you're not doing this alone, ever.
From the partner's perspective, it's kind of a double whammy though, because not only are you dealing with the secrets and lies and just all of the craziness of the addiction in general, but you're feeling rejected. We hear lots of partners in all of our webinars and drop-in groups talking about, they want to be sexual, but they don't trust the person enough that they still have physical needs, sexual needs, but but he's either not meeting them or she's not meeting them, or they still don't feel 100% comfortable and struggle to enjoy the sex they're having. Do you see that with a lot of people you deal with, David?
I do. Oftentimes, what's going on there, if we dig a little bit, is that if people aren't progressing in a way they think they should be, one of the things I look for is if people are keeping those older kind of addictive fantasies and sexual scripts alive in their head, even though they may be trying to interact with a partner, if they're going to those places in their fantasies, it's keeping that alive. And it kind of, so for example, with my stimulant addicts, if they have associated certain kind of sexual behavior with a lot of methamphetamine or cocaine, they have to really get out of those fantasies when they're trying to have, and I hate the term, but healthy sex, normal sex, recovery sex, drug-free, acting-out-free sex, because they really need to be able to focus on the partner in the present tense. If they're, and this is a common problem because people do struggle to have erections, they have struggled to have orgasms, and sometimes the kind of magic button to help them have an orgasm with their partner is to go off in their head to that addicted place, the sort of meth fantasy place or the sex addict place or the prostitute place, and in their fantasy, and that allows them to have an orgasm. The problem is that's keeping that alive, and it's going to lock them into that point where they're not going to be able to really move forward in terms of an emotional depth with their partner at that point. So you got to really, the thing about arousal templates is that map of things that people were attracted to, qualities and so on. We can add to that, and during our addictive phases, our arousal temples are constantly collecting new interesting things that we may find hot, and they never go away. And so I think the only way we can deal with those in recovery is to just not go there, because they'll always be there. If we come across it and get triggered, it'll light up. So it's very important to understand where those buttons are for us and avoid them. But even if we're trying to satisfy our partner by having an orgasm, the only way we can do that is to go there. That's a really destructive kind of workaround that will keep people really tied up and held back.
Yeah, one of the things we see with the young guys who are struggling with what we call porn-induced erectile dysfunction is that they don't struggle with porn. They get erections, they have an orgasm, they're great. A real-world partner, no matter how attractive she is, no matter how much they love her, they're struggling. It's like a real issue for them. And it doesn't mean they don't love their partner, or it doesn't mean they're not attracted. They're having a neurophysiobiological, whatever the term is, reaction that prevents them from doing something that they know is good for them, or that they really, truly, deeply want, but can't seem to enjoy because their brain is so messed up right now.
And I just want to touch on that, the last question too, where she talked about her husband rejecting her, and is that normal? And we've kind of answered in some detail, yeah, it is normal, and why it's normal and how that goes. But I don't want to minimize the impact on the partner, as Scott just mentioned. It is a normal thing. Unfortunately, we see it all the time. But boy, it's a terribly painful moment and realization and working through for the partner, who has not only the rejection, the misunderstanding, the betrayal, all those feelings that are swirling around. So I don't at all, by saying it's normal, want to minimize the impact that the partner feels with this whole process, kind of the inadvertent casualty of the process. And to follow up on that, then the partner really needs to make sure they have support and support groups and good information and things like that, where they can have their own path to recovery.
David, just kind of, we've got a couple minutes left here. I kind of wanted to bring it back to the beginner's mind a little bit. Where does having the beginner's mind come into this process of, with the brain also healing from the addiction? Are there things people can do to, practice the beginner's mind that might help the brain heal more quickly, or am I completely off base?
No, not at all. It's a great, I love that. And I think it's important to bring it back to that. And yes, there are some things we can do that can help a great deal. One is to practice mindfulness, which is just simply being in the present. It's sitting here noticing what I'm feeling, my stomach's growling, or it's too cold outside, or I'm worried about something I have to do next week, or all that stuff's kind of going on. Mindfulness is just sitting here being aware of what's going on right here. And I think training our brains, and that's a very different experience for most addicts. And training our brains how to do that is a skill, and it teaches the brain how to start getting into that mode. Also, if we're mindful, we're aware, we're seeing stuff that we may not have seen before. I think most of us walk through our lives, whether we're addicts or not, walk through our lives with kind of blinders on. We have a set of expectations of how it's going to go. We don't really notice stuff around us. So I think really being in the present and being mindful of it. And the other thing I'd be aware of is whatever derails you with falling out of the beginner's mind. And for me, and for a lot of people, I think it's that critical voice. It's the chatter in my head. It's the kind of undermining negative stuff that we all have from time to time. But to really identify that and disconnect with that, and just kind of not get pulled, not get hijacked by the negativity, but to really stay in. And I'd bring it back to a word we talked about earlier, just really try to use the magic, capture that magic, look for the magic. What is the and I kind of, I make that little game sometimes, just going through the day, where's the magic at Starbucks, maybe there's some magical moment with a moment of kindness with somebody, or magic and coincidences happening, or just an amazing share at a meeting that was very healing for me. There's things like that. I think just noticing, and not being jaded, but really being fresh and I hate to use the term childlike, but I guess notice the magic. Yeah.
One of the things I did in early recovery that was suggested to me, I live in Palm Springs in California, which is a very beautiful place. We have mountains, we have palm trees. You know, I can sit by the pool and look up through palm trees and see snow on the top of the mountains. It's really cool. But when I was very in early recovery when I moved here, and it was suggested to me that, you know, if I'm up at early, you know, a little after dawn, or also a little before the sun goes behind the mountain, you know, the magic hour for photography, to, if I'm in my car, pull the car over and stop and just look around for a minute. Just pause for 30 or 60 seconds and just look around. And I started doing that. And I started to realize that there was something outside of me, first of all, which was quite the realization. And then it was beautiful. And you know, it really slowed me down and kind of made me understand where I am and what I'm doing and what's important. So yeah, the mindfulness that David mentioned, yeah, there's 100 ways to practice that, and it really did. It helped me. So
yeah.
Anything else you want to wrap up with, David?
I think not. Nice discussion. Good questions. So,
well,
yeah.
Fantastic, everybody. Thank you for tuning in tonight. David will be back in 2 weeks, as will I. And we'll see you then. Next week, we have Miro Roski doing our Gay Men's Drop-In group at this time. So if you're a gay man or know one who wants to join us, please do so or let them know. And we'll see you in a couple weeks. Thanks, everybody.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
David.